In or out of the EU? That's the question that's going to be put to the British public 4 months from now. In the meantime, British Prime Minister David Cameron has been kickstarting his campaign in the House of Commons. That was in London this afternoon. He's essentially been telling lawmakers that Britain would be stronger, both in terms of the economy and in terms of safety, stronger within the EU. And that, it appears, is going to be the main argument that the British Prime Minister is going to be selling his domestic audience over the next 4 years. So discussing this with us today are Alexis Poulain, Director of Euractiv France, who's on set with us. From Edinburgh is David Coburn, British MEP and a member of UKIP party, Eurosceptic party. From Brussels is Charles Tannock with us, also a British MEP, member of the Conservative Party. And from London, Joe Twyman, head of the Political and Social Research Unit for YouGov. And just before we get back to you and before we get back to Mr. Twyman, I'd like to go through some of the topics that have a lot of Britons very hesitant about continuing to be in the EU.
David Cameron's deal with European partners is intended to sell EU membership to a somewhat wary British public. But Eurosceptics such as UKIP leader Nigel Farage are not convinced, saying the UK remains subservient to Brussels.
The deal that he's done does not address the fundamental issues that British people care about. It does not address the issue that our Parliament is not able to overrule bad EU law.
A perceived loss of sovereignty and EU regulation have long fuelled British discontent with the European Union. In Dover in the southwest of England, this remains a concern for voters.
What I object to is the control of our day-to-day lives and interests by the EU in what we are doing here in this country.
In recent years, immigration has become a bone of contention, with many Britons unhappy with the influx of other EU citizens, even as more than 1 million British people themselves live elsewhere in the EU.
The fundamental issue and the number one issue in British politics, which is that we have a total open door to over 500 million people.
Britain has also resented its contribution to the EU budget, being one of the top 5 contributors, though it does get a 2/3 rebate because it benefits less from the Common Agricultural Policy.
I'm out, mainly because I think we should be more self-sufficient in this country and consider our farmers, and, you know, we need a better deal, I think.
June's referendum will not be the first time British voters have been asked to decide on staying in Europe. In 1975, just 2 years after the UK joined the then EEC, 67% of voters opted to stay.
Well, let's head to London, where Joe Twyman is standing by, head of political and social research for YouGov. Joe, do the poll numbers tell us what is most important to Britons? Do we know what they're voting on first and foremost?
Well, it's interesting you should phrase the question in that way, because yes, we do know what are important to people in terms of membership of the European Union, what are the things that people like, what are the things that people don't like. But I have a feeling that when it comes down to it, the question of how people will vote will be determined by something very different. Let me explain. When you ask people what are some of the best things about being in Europe, people talk about freedom of movement, the ability for Britons to go and work in other European countries, to have houses there, etc., to travel without too many problems and to be part of the economic area. When you ask people what's worst about being in Europe, people say, a lot of people say, well, migration, the fact that people can come here and have jobs and work freely and travel without too many restrictions. But really, it's not about these specifics. It's not about the intricacies of European policies. It's not about the kind of debate that we heard earlier, and it's not about the kind of arguments that are raging at the moment over the renegotiations.
So what is it about?
When you ask people about the renegotiations, they generally approve of everything that has been gained, but feel that it's not enough. Instead, what this is all about are the broad questions, the broad stories that we tell ourselves and each other about membership of Europe, and it will be that the vote is depending on. And so that means the kind of questions that David Cameron is trying to raise with the comments that he's given. So he wants to raise the question, is Britain safer in Europe? Is Britain stronger as part of Europe? Is Britain better for you and people like your family as part of members of the European Union? Are jobs secured? Are prices lower? All these sorts of things are the kind of questions, these broad themes that will determine the result. Because in 1975, as your correspondent quite rightly said, by a margin of 2-1, we voted to stay. But months before that, the polls were showing precisely the opposite. And so we know that there's a huge potential for change as the debate moves from these very specific, delicate matters of minutiae into broad themes that people can understand and the average person in the street can engage with.
So you're confirming essentially that the deal that David Cameron got, some of it is quite technical. Some of those technicalities are not necessarily trickling down to the average British voter.
At this stage in the campaign, the average person in the street and the 50% of people less engaged than the average person in the street really isn't paying that much attention to this. They may have a broad understanding of whether Britain can be right or wrong for them, whether they think they get a fair deal or not. But when it comes to the negotiations, the most they will perhaps understand is whether they think it's good or bad. But even that, this far out from the campaign really gathering speed, will mean that come June the 23rd, the results will depend on these broad themes rather than anything specific. It won't be about it won't be about a single personality. It won't be about a single issue. It'll be about these broad understandings.
Charles Tannock, MEP in Brussels, Conservative for the Conservative Party. You were telling us earlier that you were confident David Cameron would secure an in-vote on the grounds that he has secured a good EU reform deal. And now we're hearing a quite compelling argument that, in fact, Britons aren't really looking at the nitty-gritty necessarily of the deal. They're looking at the narrative, the big picture, big story. When it comes to that, are you concerned that Eurosceptics, UKIP among them, but also members of your Conservative Party, have an easier case to make?
Well, I think just taking out what Nigel Farage was saying there earlier on, that we have an open border to 500 million people, clearly that's absolute nonsense. For a start, one of the concessions that David Cameron has now achieved in writing is that anybody who presents at the British borders, and we still have passport checks for EU citizens, anybody who presents who is perceived as being a danger to public security, even without a criminal record, can be excluded at the border. Anybody who comes into Britain seeking work and is unable to find work within a space of time will no longer be able to stay indefinitely in the United Kingdom. They will have to return to their country of origin. And I think most interestingly, in future, if you are an EU citizen, you will not be allowed under the deal that Cameron negotiated to bring in a foreign spouse in the way that's been the case so far, and the sham marriages and the abuse of that privilege under the treaties. You will have no more or no less rights than a British citizen. So just on the issue of open borders, I think there have been some significant changes and understandings with our European Union partners that you cannot just come to Britain and land yourself on the state. And furthermore, the issue of the pull factor, whereby our very generous in-work benefits, that will be, as it were, stopped for up to 4 years and will be introduced gradually and slowly. So there will not be the right to arrive in Britain and have access to all the in-work benefits. Neither will you have the right in future for child benefits if you leave children behind in, say, Poland at the same rate as those living in the UK. It will be reduced to the cost of living of the country you come from. So I think all these factors come together to give a balanced form of EU migration within the 28 countries. Just remember that there are something like 2.1 or 2.2 million British citizens living and working in all over the European Union, mainly in Italy, France, Spain, etc. And there's 2.4 million EU citizens working in the UK. It's a balanced equation. In fact, if you look back over the last 20 years, 2/3 of the net migrants who've settled in the United Kingdom have come from non-EU countries. They've come from the rest of the world. So the EU factor is actually the minority factor in terms of net migration to the United Kingdom. So this is a very emotional issue. It's a gift, of course, to UKIP and Nigel Farage that there is a crisis on our shores of Europe, from the Mediterranean, in Greece and in Italy, as a result of the conflicts in the Middle East, and the fact that I think wrongly, in my view, Chancellor Merkel gave the wrong signal of an open door policy to Germany. So people feel they've been invited now to come from all over the globe and land on EU territory. And with the Schengen system, of course, that is exacerbated. But Britain is not part of the common asylum and immigration system. We are not part of Schengen, and therefore it doesn't directly affect us. We are not forced to take quotas from the migrants and the refugees that arrive from Africa and the Middle East, and particularly from Syria and Iraq.
Now, in a moment, I want to talk about the role of Boris Johnson here and how important he is.
I'd like to come in. Do you mind if I come into this point here?
David Coburn, go right ahead.
Important, I should have said. Yes, number one, Britons voted back in the 1970s to be part of a common market, an economic trading zone. They did not vote to become part of a European superstate with a flag, a European gendarmerie, a national anthem, and all the rest of it. That was not what people voted for. And no one wants that now. People want to trade with Europe, but they do not want to be owned or dictated to by Europe. We want our sovereignty back. We want decisions taken in Westminster and Holyrood. We do not want decisions taken in Brussels and that qualified by 27 other states. Absolutely not on. And that is untrue what Charles has said. We are open to half a billion people. Anyone can come to our country. As long as we're members of the European area, we cannot stop anyone coming into our country.
David Coburn, let me just interrupt you here. I have a reaction to what you're saying on set.
It's like saying that the whole of the United States can enter Britain on a tourist visa. That's completely different from saying they have the right to live.
Okay, hold on, gentlemen. Let's take it one issue at a time. David Coburn, I need you to listen to me. I have a reaction for you on set. Alexis Poulain, director of Euractiv France, disagrees with you when you're referring to the European superstate. Alexis.
It's never written anywhere this European superstate is pure creation of anti-EU lobbies. The ever closer union goes into harmonizing social policies or tax policies. And if I listen to the yes and the no camp on the Brexit, well, I think you all agree. It's a very liberal take on Europe. You want a free market. You want that the goods move, but you want to block.
We want to trade with Europe.
You want to block the people. Yes, exactly. That's what I said. Let me finish. You want to trade with Europe, but you don't want people to move in and out. But if you look at your independence as UK, where will the energy come from? Now we talk about an energy union that could help Britain get energy at the cheapest rate. What will happen once the UK leave? You will get the gas from Russia. You have to think of all this. You're looking at closing borders, but trade is not just selling and bringing goods. There is also a lot of interchange that already exists between European member states, and UK, of course, is part of this.
David Coburn.
Well, absolute nonsense for starters. We can trade with anyone we like in the world. Once we're out of the European Union, we can make trade treaties with who we like. At the moment, the European Union...
Sure, but how will you get your gas? How much will cost the gas?
Let me finish. Number one, we are forced to accept the TTIP treaty, which means American companies can basically bully our National Health Service into taking what they want to take.
TTIP is nothing signed yet. It's negotiation. Well, we got the 22nd round coming this month.
Britain has a seat on the World Trade Organization. Why we not take our own seat there? We can make our own treaties, do things that
Britain's got its own seat. That's factually incorrect, David.
Oh, wait a minute. Let me just say something that the Chinese... Iceland has got a trade treaty with China. The European Union can't even get one together. We'll do our own trade treaty with China. We'll do our own trade treaty with the United States. We don't need the European Union.
And you think you get the good deal alone?
Yes, a very good deal. Good. And I'll tell you something else. Much better than a bankrupt Europe where France, Italy, Spain, Portugal and Greece are on the edge of bankruptcy due to a European currency, which was not an economic policy. It was a political currency and not an economic currency. And we totally opposed it. And it's disastrous for Europe, and it's been disastrous for the world. And quite frankly, I don't see why we should be dragged down by that currency. And that's what will happen.
I'd like to hear more about the role of Boris Johnson and whether or not he's a game changer, how important he is in this campaign. I'm going back to Joe Twyman for this. Boris Johnson, I mean, a lot has been made about the fact that this has as much to do with his political future as it does with really his beliefs on Europe.
Yes, that's right. We'll never know the true motivations for any of Boris's decisions, but certainly as a strategic move, if he wanted to be Prime Minister and indeed leader of the Conservative Party, this would not necessarily be disastrous. Boris is an interesting character. He at times during his reign as Mayor of London, he has attracted approval ratings of over 50% from supporters of all parties. Now, this is almost completely unheard of in British national politics, and part of that has rested on the fact that whatever your view, you think Boris shares that view. So if you're pro-immigration, you think Boris is pro-immigration. If you're anti-EU, you think Boris is anti-EU. The difficulty he has now is that he's come from this position of popularity, but he's now been forced to come down on one side. And it's likely that some of that popularity will, as a result, wane. He's already said that he won't play a full campaigning role in the vote to leave, so no one's quite sure exactly what that means. But within polling, you're always interested in talking about the distinctions between talking points and turning points. In other words, those events, those personalities that change opinion for good, and those moments that change opinion, but then it just moves back to where it was before. I imagine that given everything that's going on, this certainly has the potential to be a turning point, but is more likely in the end to be a talking point.
Charles Tannock in Brussels, how concerned are you that Boris Johnson, a super popular figure in the Conservative Party, has turned against the Prime Minister for this campaign?
Well, obviously I'm disappointed, but I have to say Nick Cohen did a very good piece in The Spectator today, basically exposing Boris for what Boris is, that he is very capable of convincing people that whatever they believe, he also believes in. And the Daily Mail did a very good piece only about 2 months ago, quoting both insiders in the Conservative Party, and Nick Soames has gone public about this, that Boris is the first to admit he's not really a Eurosceptic and that he's not really an outer. And so it will be very hard for him to explain away both statements he's made publicly, like in an interview to the Japanese press, being overheard saying to Bernard Jenkins he wasn't really an outer, siding with people in the House of Commons who are not on the Eurosceptic wing. I think Boris is manoeuvring himself into a position of, as it were, if there is a Brexit and there is a change of leadership and Prime Minister Cameron has to resign, that he would be the front runner to replace David Cameron. I'm not at all convinced by Johnson's Euroscepticism. I don't think it's particularly sincere. The fact that he was so poor in his performance today in the House of Commons and had to abstract about nostalgic concepts of 19th century British sovereignty speaks volumes. I mean, Boris Johnson's middle name is de Pfeffer. He descends from German princes. His family come from all over Europe.
So does the Queen.
I think he would find it very hard in his instincts to feel his middle name is Boris de Pfeffer, Boris de Pfeffer Johnson. He'd find it very hard in his heart to be a hardline Eurosceptic.
Do you believe that undercuts his sincerity in wanting to take Britain out of the EU? Is that what you're saying?
What I'm trying to say is that Boris is Boris and is interested in what will advance his position in the Conservative Party. As a politician, he is ambitious. There's no harm in that. I just personally don't think he has a track record of serious Euroscepticism. I wasn't surprised by the other figures who announced earlier. Basically, it took a very long time for him to get off the fence and make up his mind. I wasn't surprised by all the others. He is the one who I'm disappointed by. And I think that the public will see through that, I'm afraid. So I don't think it's a game changer in the campaign at all. This is a much bigger issue than individuals. Even David Cameron is the most superb Prime Minister and leader and very, very good at articulating his message, alone cannot make the difference unless we can get our messages through to the British public, and they are prepared to put trust in the fact that our negotiations are significant and that there is no such thing as a country called Europe. This is a complete invention and fantasy of the Eurosceptics. I've worked in this parliament for 16 years. I've never been aware of being in a country called the European Union. I've always been treated with respect.
You haven't been at the raising of the flag, Charles, when they sing the anthem.
You know, the fact of the matter is that you can make sort of, you know, cheap comments about the flag and the anthem.
Well, cheap comments about...
you know, when in Rome, do it. Well, listen, David, the fact of the matter is that NATO has got its own flag as well. So does the United Nations. So what? That doesn't make NATO into a country or the UN.
They do not tell us what to do. They don't run our economy.
But the point is, they don't run our economy either. We've got our own currency. We set our own taxes. This is complete nonsense. This is complete nonsense. It's complete nonsense. It's complete nonsense. They run our own economy. We retain the sterling. Our monetary policy. We retain control of our fiscal policy. And David Cameron has managed to get a deal whereby it's absolutely clear that there will be an emergency brake on any caucusing done against the City of London and its interests. I am convinced in the sad event that there is a Brexit and the economy starts to shrink rather than grow, there'll be many people who said to people like David, well, you guaranteed that there will be a fantastically prosperous Britain outside of the European Union. Well, the fact of the matter is we've been in the European Union for 45 years and we are a prosperous Britain. Unemployment's at an all-time low right now. We're growing more than the Eurozone. What more do you want? Why take a risk? Why take a leap into the dark? Why not have the best of both worlds, whereby we have so many opt-outs already? We have the opt-outs from the currency, from Schengen, from the asylum and immigration policy, from all sorts of areas where already Britain has a special deal. But as far as David and people like him are concerned, we are not totally sovereign. Well, I'm afraid to say there is no such thing as 100% sovereignty in the modern world. We live in a very interconnected world.
About the modern world.
Charles Tannock, David Coburn, if I can just stop you there for a moment. We have less than a minute left in this debate. Alexis Poulain wants to weigh...
Just one word about the modern world. As you said, we live and who runs the economy? And if you see all the big companies, international, global companies like Google and others, not to name a few, they don't pay taxes in the country they're operating. And Europe is trying to change this so that we got transparency and we got the taxes coming back to the countries. How will the UK make that happen? I mean, you will be so isolated. There is a risk here. And you say the economy is very interconnected. And it's not just Europe, it's the world. And here, looking at the Brexit debate is all about thinking that UK is an island that can produce everything, from gas to a big British steel industry, which is the world of yesterday. The world of today is about interconnection, is about countries selling and trading, and also people moving from country to country.
All right, thank you very much, gentlemen. I'd like to thank everyone for being on set with us today. Alexis Poulain, who's right here with me in Paris, David Coburn in Edinburgh, Charles Tannock in Brussels, Joe Twyman in London. Thank you all for this passionate debate. I know there'll be more of this between now and June 23rd on the day of the referendum. Thank you all for being with us on the France 24 debate. And we welcome James Creedon from Media Watch. Good evening, James.
Hi, Cyril.
A lot of reactions in the British press to Boris Johnson's Brexit announcement. We've just been talking about this.
That's right. It's really dominated British press coverage and the British papers this morning, probably tomorrow morning as well. Let's take a look at some of those headlines. It's time to take control. Boris goes in for the kill. I think across the board, really, it was being interpreted as Boris Johnson unveiling his own ambitions, in fact, for number 10. Blonde bombshell, says The Sun, and the Daily Telegraph devoting half of their front page to an image of Boris Johnson in front of the Union Jack. Boris, why Britain should say no to the EU. So a lot of people interpreting that really as not so much about Brexit, but Boris, really, it's all about him becoming PM, because he is positioning himself here, of course, against the Prime Minister, David Cameron, who in response has very much hit back at Boris Johnson in what the Telegraph called an astonishing attack in his comment speech. I am not standing for re-election, said David Cameron. I have no other agenda other than what's best for our country. I suppose the implication being there that Boris Johnson is doing this more out of self-interest than out of any national interest, although, of course, he would argue differently. In any case, everyone says good evening and welcome to our next Prime Minister. This is very much a right-wing and anti-EU columnist for the Daily Mail. So you can see the tone of the general response there. MPs on both sides of the aisle trying to make the case that the best reason to vote to remain in is because it would really annoy Putin. So that's some slightly different tone of response. So it's really, as I say, if you look at hashtag Brexit today, which is, of course, the hashtag that gathers together a lot of this comment, it's dominated by bumbling Boris, who is actually quite ambitious, and other such remarks. I'll finish with this one. Stella Duffy. Boris, Farage, Gove, Galloway. Dear France, can we come and stay, please? Well, that might get complicated, but for now we can say yes, Stella.
All right.
Come on over. Get on a Eurostar.
James Creedon,
Thanks,
welcoming Stella Duffy.
That's right.
James Creedon with Media Watch. Thank you very much. Do stay tuned to France 24. More news coming up right after the break.